You get the raise. Finally, the number you've been quietly calculating for months, maybe years, materializes in an offer letter. Relief, yes. Validation, certainly. But underneath, something else. A feeling you weren't expecting. Not quite anxiety. Not quite disappointment. Just a strange, persistent sense that you've stepped into a room you don't yet understand the rules for. Most people think the mistake happens in the spending. That's not it. The spending is just the visible part of something quieter. The real mistake happens in the 48 hours after you accept. It's a psychological shift, a recalibration of what feels normal, and once it happens, it's almost impossible to reverse without friction you weren't prepared for. This isn't about budgeting. It's about the architecture of your internal sense of safety, and how a single number on a document quietly begins to dismantle it. Here's what actually happens. You get the raise. Let's say $20,000 more annually. After taxes, maybe $12,000, $13,000. An extra $1,000 a month, give or take. Meaningful, but not transformative. Not the kind of money that changes your relationship with risk. But your brain doesn't process it that way. Your brain processes it as, the baseline just moved. Within weeks, sometimes days. That extra $1,000 doesn't feel like surplus. It feels like what you now earn. And because it feels normal, anything below it starts to feel like deprivation. You haven't spent more yet, not significantly. But the psychological threshold has shifted. What used to feel adequate now feels slightly cramped. Not because your circumstances worsened. Because your expectations auto-adjusted. This is called hedonic adaptation. But the term doesn't capture the specific danger of the post-raise moment. Because hedonic adaptation in consumption, buying something, enjoying it less over time, that's well understood. This is different. This is adaptation in identity. You begin to see yourself as someone who earns this amount. And that identity carries assumptions about what your life should look like. The quiet mistake isn't lifestyle inflation in the traditional sense. It's baseline inflation. The raise doesn't get absorbed into savings or margin. It gets absorbed into your new sense of normal. And your new sense of normal determines every subsequent financial decision you make. Not consciously. Automatically. Sit with that for a moment. You now have a higher floor. But you don't have more freedom. You have a more expensive identity to maintain. Let me describe the mechanism more precisely. Before the raise, you had a buffer. Not a large one maybe, but a buffer. A psychological distance between what you earned and what you needed to feel secure. That buffer was doing something important. It was absorbing uncertainty. It was allowing you to think about money less. When something unexpected came up, a medical bill, a car repair, it was stressful, yes. But it didn't immediately threaten your sense of stability. After the raise, that buffer doesn't grow proportionally. Because your spending doesn't spike immediately. What happens instead is subtler. Your mental accounting shifts. You begin to allocate the raise before you have it. Not explicitly. Not in a spreadsheet. But in the story you tell yourself about what's reasonable. You start thinking, we can finally afford to move to a slightly better neighborhood. We can upgrade the car when the lease ends. We can stop cutting corners on groceries. We can take that trip we've been deferring. None of these individually are reckless. Taken together, they represent a creeping redefinition of your baseline. And here's the part that surprises people. You often end up with less psychological safety after the raise than before it. Because your actual margin hasn't grown. You've just pushed your floor higher. And the higher your floor, the further you have to fall when something disrupts your income. The higher your floor, the more fragile your sense of security. This is the quiet mistake. Not spending the raise, absorbing it into your identity so completely that you forget it was ever additive. Most financial advice tells you to automate savings before you feel the raise. Transfer it immediately. Don't let yourself adapt. That's technically sound, but it misses the psychological reality. The raise doesn't just hit your bank account. It hits your self-concept. You're not just earning more. You're signaling to yourself, and often to others, that you've progressed, that you've moved up. And that signal carries expectations. If you automate the raise into savings, that's responsible. But you still know the number. You still know you're earning more. And part of you, often unconsciously, starts expecting your life to reflect that. If your life doesn't change, the raise starts to feel wasted, not rationally, emotionally, and emotions, over time, corrode rational plans. This is why people with rising incomes often feel financially tighter than they did earlier in their careers. Not because they're making mistakes in the obvious sense. Because their identity costs are rising faster than their income. Let's look at what this actually costs you, not in dollars, though we'll get there, but in degrees of freedom. Because that's what financial security actually is. Not the size of the number, the range of options you can exercise without fear. Before the raise. Let's say you were living on $50,000 a year, not comfortably, but manageably. You had constraints, sure, but those constraints were familiar. You knew how to navigate them. You knew where the boundaries were. That knowledge, that certainty about your limitations, was a form of clarity. You weren't wondering whether you could afford something. You knew. After the raise, you're living on $65,000 or $70,000. But now the boundaries aren't clear anymore. You're in a new earnings bracket. But you haven't yet built the instincts for it. You don't know what's reasonable anymore. And because you don't know, you test. You experiment. Not recklessly. Just a little more freely. A nicer dinner becomes normal. The slightly more expensive coffee becomes routine. The subscription you were on the fence about, now it feels fine. None of these are individually significant. But they're signals. Signals to yourself that your constraints have loosened. And once you've sent that signal, it's hard to retract it without feeling like you're moving backward. Here's the second-order effect. You lose optionality. Because your new baseline is higher, your flexibility is lower. If you want to make a career shift, take a role that's more interesting but pays less. Try something uncertain. You now have less room to do that. Not because your savings decreased. Because your identity is more expensive to maintain. You've traded immediate comfort for long-term freedom. And most people don't realize they've made that trade until years later, when they feel trapped in a job they've outgrown, but can't afford to leave. This is the part most people miss. The raise doesn't just change your budget. It changes your trajectory. It locks in assumptions about what your life should cost. And those assumptions compound. 3 years after the raise, you're not just spending more. You're structured around spending more. Your lease is higher. Your car payment is higher. Your social context has shifted. You're around people who spend at your new level, which makes that level feel normal. You haven't made any single catastrophic decision. You've just drifted into a more expensive equilibrium. And here's what's insidious. That equilibrium feels earned. You worked for the raise. You deserve the life it affords. That's not wrong. But deserving something and being able to sustain it are different questions. And if your life costs exactly what you earn, or close to it, you haven't increased your security. You've increased your dependence on continuity. Your safety now requires that nothing disrupts your income. No layoffs, no industry contractions, no health issues that affect your performance, no desire to take time off or recalibrate. You need stability, and the more you need stability, the less freedom you have to pursue anything that threatens it. This is why raises, paradoxically, often make people more risk-averse. Not because they have less cushion, because they have more to protect. Their baseline is higher. Their identity is more expensive. And protecting that identity becomes a primary motivation, often unconscious, in every career decision they make. The professionals who navigate this well, and they're rare, do something counterintuitive. They treat the raise as if it didn't happen. Not forever, but for a defined period, 6 months, a year. They let the money accumulate without changing their felt sense of normal. They create what you might call identity lag. A deliberate gap between what they earn and who they feel they are. This isn't asceticism. It's not deprivation. It's recognition that your internal sense of normal is the most valuable asset you have. More valuable than the raise itself. Because if you can keep your baseline low while your income rises, you're building something rare. Margin. Real margin. The kind that doesn't just absorb shocks. The kind that creates options. Margin is what allows you to think long-term. To take risks that don't feel reckless. To say no to work that pays well but drains you. To explore whether there's a version of your career that's more aligned with who you're becoming. Not just who you were when you started. But margin requires restraint, and restraint, after a raise, feels like denial, like you're not letting yourself enjoy the reward you earned. This is the tension. And most people resolve it by spending. Because spending feels like affirming the progress they've made. The professionals who resolve it differently, who preserve margin, they're not more disciplined. They're thinking in longer time horizons. They're asking a different question. Not, what can I afford now? But, what do I want to be able to afford to do in 5 years? And afford here doesn't mean money. It means freedom. The ability to make decisions based on fit, not fear. The ability to leave a situation that's no longer working without catastrophic consequences. The ability to take a year to retrain. Or start something. Or simply stop and reconsider. That ability, real optionality, is built in the gap between what you earn and what you spend. And the wider that gap, the more your life is shaped by choice rather than momentum. Here's what happens when you close that gap. When you let your spending rise to meet your income, you become dependent on continuity. And dependence breeds a specific kind of anxiety. Not the acute anxiety of immediate financial crisis, the chronic, low-grade anxiety of knowing you can't afford disruption, that you need everything to keep working, that you're one recession, one restructuring, one health issue away from having to make decisions you're not ready for. This is why people with high incomes often describe feeling trapped. They're not trapped by poverty. They're trapped by their own expectations, by the life they've built that now requires their income to sustain it. And the weight of that requirement is heavier than they anticipated. The raise was supposed to create relief. Instead, it created a new set of constraints, more subtle, more invisible, but no less binding. There's a quieter path. It doesn't involve denying yourself the raise. It involves not letting the raise redefine you. Treating it as surplus, even when it doesn't feel like surplus. Letting it accumulate until the accumulation itself shifts what's possible. Not what's normal. What's possible. This takes time, longer than feels reasonable, because margin builds slowly. But that slowness is the point. You're not optimizing for immediate comfort. You're optimizing for long-term freedom. And freedom, real freedom, is expensive. Not in the cost of what you buy. In the cost of what you're willing to forego in order to preserve your options. Most people don't think in these terms. They think in terms of fairness. I earned this. I should be able to enjoy it. And that's not wrong. But enjoyment is a spectrum. Immediate enjoyment versus deferred optionality. And the choice between them is rarely explicit. It happens automatically. In the weeks after the raise. When your sense of normal quietly resets. If you catch it early. If you create that identity lag, you can shape the outcome. You can decide, deliberately, what kind of life you're building. Not just what you're buying. What you're preserving the ability to choose. If you miss it, you don't lose everything. You just lock in a trajectory. And trajectories are harder to alter the further along you go. Not impossible. Just harder. The professionals who understand this, who really understand it, they're not more frugal. They're more intentional. They've thought through what they actually want their life to afford them. Not in terms of consumption. In terms of time, attention, the ability to say no, the ability to walk away, the ability to spend a year figuring out what they actually want to do next, instead of taking the first offer that maintains their lifestyle. That ability is what margin buys. And it's bought in the space between what you earn and what you need to feel like yourself. The raise isn't the mistake. The mistake is letting it collapse that space before you've built enough of it to matter. You can't get this time back. The weeks after a raise are the only moment when your old baseline still feels real. When your brain hasn't yet adjusted. When you still have the psychological flexibility to bank the difference. Once the adjustment happens, once your new income feels normal, it's exponentially harder to create margin. Because now you're not just saving money, you're cutting from your baseline. And cutting from your baseline feels like loss. This is why the mistake is quiet. It doesn't feel like a mistake. It feels like adjustment. Like appropriate recognition of your progress. And by the time you realize the cost, the pattern is already set. You're earning more. But you're not freer. You're just more expensive.